So tonight's topic was actually suggested by someone after the talk last week, and I thought it was a really excellent topic. And it engages a series of things having to do with that period after which we've realized something fundamental. And so the topic is vigilance, humility, and the dream of perfection. Okay, so there's a lot of fruitful territory there to explore. So there's several myths about awakening that can cause confusion after we have recognized our own true nature. So it's good to know about them beforehand. One is the presumption that awakening is a one-way street. Once awakened, you never can be unawakened again. The ego may be mortally wounded by a glimpsing awakeness, but that's not at all to say that it is an irreversible process that we can no longer become lost in thought again. So we'll explore that a little bit more. Another myth is that it's a one-step process, that you're not awake and then you are awake, and there's no gradations of awakeness. And there's no further seeing after a true awakening. We'll see that that's also not true. And the third aspect of this is that this is a less prevalent myth, but still in popular circulation, and that is that an enlightened being is perfect, and if there's any indication of imperfection, then obviously that person is not enlightened. So it's a yardstick, perfection as a yardstick for how we judge someone else's seeing into their true nature. So that's also not true. So we'll explore all of these things. So the awakening, we'll just define it briefly, but awakening can be described as seeing that our true innate nature is not subject to, not limited by thoughts, feelings, experiences, etc. It is what notices thoughts, feelings, and experiences. So this would be an illusion, this idea that we possess a separate self. It's a very compelling illusion. It's what we were all brought up to more or less assume to be true without ever really questioning it or being taught it directly, but just it's just sort of a cultural assumption, cultural paradigm that what we are is a separate self that has thoughts, feelings, generates history, is able to think our own thoughts, take actions on behalf of some intuited entity somewhere within us, maybe probably in our head somewhere, that is what's in charge. It's the one managing all of these cognitive abilities. So the awakening is seeing that that's actually not true, that there never was this separate self entity um, lurking about in there somewhere. And the way we discover that is to actually look for ourselves to see if that's true or not. Um, and if we look with great intensity, with great fearlessness to see what is actually true, and we don't find anything there, we can see all um, the things that we experience, that we can see thoughts and feelings and memories and hopes and dreams and regrets and all of that. That's not a problem. What we don't find is that entity to which all of those things are happening. That's what we don't find. And, it's not a philosophical statement. It's something that has value only if we check it out for ourselves with great intensity, not as a belief to be believed or not to be believed. That has um, less than, that's less than helpful, right? Um, it actually gets in the way, a belief this way or that way. What is helpful is to examine it in our own direct experience and see if we can find that personal self-entity in there somewhere, independent of everything that's transient, independent of thought, feelings, experiences, memories, etc. And anything that is subject to impermanence, we can't hang our hat on. So we just need to see what, if anything, there is as a separate entity apart from the rest of existence, um, lurking about there somewhere. And awakening is the recognition that there's not, that what we truly are is this awareness, which is that within which thought and feelings, experiences happen. So it has the capacity to experience all of that, but in itself is not that. In itself is already free of that. So that's the brief definition of awakening. So when we first glimpse um, this awakeness, this awareness that we are, it feels like I've seen the whole thing. How could I have missed it? Now that I've seen it, I can't possibly ever lose sight of it again. Um, that's the sense of it. Feels absolutely clear, absolutely obvious, um, and and yet most of the time, not always, but most of the time, it fades from view. So this is what you may have heard people say, I had it and then I lost it. I had this experience 20 years ago and then I've been trying to get it back and I haven't. But I did have it one time. I had, and so sometimes this can be um, seen as an event, right? That a particular event was so profound that event is awakening. But that's not true. Events are never awakeness. They may accompany some recognition of awakeness, but very often we mistake the event, the circumstances of the event, the appearances for the true seeing of awakeness. And there might have been enough awakeness there that that sense of awakeness remains for a while. But if we believe that it was in the circumstances of the event, the fireworks of the event, when that begins to fade, it will feel like we've lost it. It's fading from grip. We can feel it receding, like the tide receding in the ocean, going out. It feels like that, right? So the illusion that what we are is the separate self is what we wake up from. An illusion, the classic example of an illusion is from India, and the example is that, let's say you walk into a room and there's something coiled in the corner of the room, and well, in India it could very likely be a snake, so your first instinct is to jump back in fear. And then you're standing over at the other side of the room and the snake hasn't moved yet. And then you take a little closer look and maybe take a few steps over in that direction. And you see, well, wait a minute, it doesn't look like a snake. And, no, actually, it's a rope. It's just a coiled rope there. I just thought it was a snake. So it wasn't that's sort of the nature of the illusion. At that point, you don't have to try to chop the rope up to get rid of the snake. You don't have to, um, try to convince yourself, that there's not a snakiness element in the rope. It's just seen as an illusion and end of story. You can walk over there, pick up the rope without concern, right? And so that is the nature of illusion, that once seen, we don't have to try to get rid of it. So in this case, the illusion that we possess this individual, egoic, separate self in there as an entity that somehow we have to appease or work with or transcend or kill off, or all of that depends on the premise that it is real in the first place. But the nature of illusion is that once seen, the misunderstanding drops of its own accord. We don't have to try to get rid of the illusion once it's seen as an illusion. It's just like the rope and the snake. We don't have to get, throw the rope out of the room in fear, thinking that it might turn back into the snake again. It's just seen that it never was the snake. Right? So that's what we mean by an illusion. So one question comes up is that can this awakeness be lost? Can I see it and then later lose it? I mean, you can read some spiritual literature saying, nope, if once you're enlightened forever, and there's no going back. But it sort of depends on your definition, right? If your definition is an abiding sense of that awakeness that isn't subject to being caught by thoughts or feelings or circumstances and taken for a ride, yeah, there's such a thing as an abiding awakeness, right? But if we had a glimpse of true seeing, it's also not to deny that wasn't real. We may have misunderstood what it was, and it may not meet the definition of abiding awakening, but it also doesn't mean that it wasn't real and that it wasn't profound. But we may have misinterpreted what it was. We may have misinterpreted it for the event, the circumstances, the fireworks, and missed what was having that experience, right? Right. So for myself, there was a 5-year gap between what I would what I consider is my first glimpse, powerful, um, full on, all the fireworks, um, and it lasted maybe 3 or 4 hours. And I was so certain that I had seen something profound, but I misinterpreted what it was. I focused on the fireworks and didn't realize what was actually being revealed in that experience. And 5 years later, there was a very quiet seeing that turned out to be to initiate an abiding seeing. So it has nothing to do with the powerful circumstances in which it's revealed. Explosive, quiet. That's not determinative. I mean, if we had a choice, we'd say, "Oh, I'd like to choose the powerful one, please," but that's not how it works. Um, and in some sense, the really powerful ones with the sort of mind-boggling fireworks and overwhelming bliss and joy and tears running down your face and belly laughter, all of that. It can also be confusing in terms of what's actually um, at the core of that experience. Again, the core of that experience is that within which all of that happens, rather than the experience itself, no matter how mind-blowing, blissful, etc. Okay, so yes, it is possible to have seen something and fall from grace. It's also possible for some, and it's happened to more than a few very clear people who have um, opened the door to egoic thoughts. And you would think that that's not possible, but it not only possible, it happens. Um, And it happens because I once asked Eckhart why that happens, Eckhart Tolle, and his answer was because teachers begin to feel special. They begin to feel like, come to think of it, this enlightenment that I've worked so hard to attain, and now there's a seeing there that those other people out there don't see it, sort of rare. Maybe I am special. That's the egoic mind coming back in. And then once you decide that there's something special about it, then um, it's easy to take the next step into some feeling of entitlement, like, well, as long as I'm special, why not accumulate a little bit of wealth, even if it's at other people's expense, certain amount of power. Again, other people expense, maybe feel entitled to, satisfy one's desires at, using other people. So these are there's other ways, of course, you can get hooked back into an egoic mindset, but those are the big three, right? The big three tripwires for spiritual teachers: money, sex, and power. And more than a few have succumbed to that, despite um, some impressive underlying clarity. But the door was left open for egoic thoughts to come back in, and the mind will do that. The mind will, even after awakening, even after profound, even abiding awakening, egoic thoughts can still arise. And any belief that they don't is both arrogant and dangerous, right? So it's not that egoic thoughts cease arising, and certainly not that all thought ceases upon recognition of our true nature. It's just not true. The mind has a certain momentum. Thoughts still will arise. We give them, those thoughts, power by whatever degree we believe that they're true. Right? So the task is not to, put our energy into trying to stop the mind from thinking. That effort, may slow down thinking, maybe even stop thinking for periods of time. So what? The important thing is to recognize that the thoughts, the random thoughts, I'm not talking about practical thoughts here, but the random thoughts, the thought of self-aggrandizement, those kind of thoughts. Those thoughts, there's a need to see them as not being true, not bestowing our belief on them, and not acting on them. That's what we can do. We can't really stop them from happening, right? It's almost like life will test us, see how awake this person is. How about this thought, Will that cause sort of re-engagement with the ego? And maybe it does. And we learn from that, and we see that, a greater degree of vigilance is needed. Right? So this vigilance that I'm talking about has a different character after awakening than before. Before awakening, vigilance is needed to sort of, in this hot pursuit of the discovery of who we really are. So there's more of a sense of, seek and destroy, go out of, pursue false beliefs, on the lookout. There's much more active kind of vigilance. After awakening, it feels, vigilance is still required, but it feels more passive. It's like everything's good until something arises that causes us um, to look at something that creates, if something creates a discomfort in the body, we say something or do something and we realize it was a little bit off. The body will tell us that. And there's sort of an ever increasing sensitivity to that, things that we might have just not noticed or ignored in the past can be quite painful. Same thing, same kind of circumstances can be quite painful when we become tuned into our body's ability to communicate when we're off base. So we can trust our body in that way. When we're talking to somebody and there feels like there's a disconnect, when we've had when we've said something that came out and we've realized it wasn't really the appropriate thing to say, wasn't really the authentic thing to say. We feel that, and it can actually be quite painful. So this awakening thing isn't a free pass at all. It actually has the feel of the path getting narrower, which is a good thing, right? It's sort of life's way of informing us at a more and more subtle level what's true. Okay, so to believe that thoughts, egoic thoughts, will never arise after awakening is a mistaken belief and dangerous, right? Because if we believe that they shouldn't and they do, what do you do with that? Do you ignore them? Do you hide them? Do you rationalize them? Do you pretend it's some, evil external force making me do it? Do you, conclude that it's some, you know, uh, dark side hidden away there somewhere? No, it's just a thought, right? It arises. We can look at it. We can see if it's actually true or not. That's what we can do. So we can't stop the thought from arising, but what we can do is look at it, see if there's any truth in it or not, um, not be embarrassed by it, not believe it shouldn't happen, not believe that we've somehow failed because it did. It's just a thought, right? So we can allow ourselves to recognize that and learn from it, see it, um, but we don't have to believe every thought that passes through our head. Okay, and then we can simply refrain from acting on it. It might be that we have enough innate clarity, or over time we learn that thoughts arise. We could just see, oh, random thought, end of story. But some of the thoughts that have a little more stickiness to them, we might have to just allow them to be there, and until we really are quite certain that they're not true, right? But allow them to um, be there to the point that we can really investigate it. So it's sort of like, imagine you're a shopkeeper, and let's say it's a hardware store that you own, and there's a young person, a known thief in the neighborhood, petty thief, nothing too serious, um, comes into your store. They're not going to buy anything. Um, so all you can do is just sort of keep an eye on this person um, until they leave, empty-handed, right? So you're not going to gain anything from it, from their presence in your store. All you're trying to do is not lose anything, right? So it's sort of like that when um, an egoic thought arises. It's not like it's going to there's a payoff there. It's like you're just going to keep an eye on it until it recedes from view. And to do that, it means that we can't oppose it, right? We can't say, oh my gosh, I've had this awakening thing and now I'm thinking this thought. That shouldn't be happening. I should be more spiritual than this. Maybe I've lost it. So all of those ways of looking at it are further engaging with it and giving it a reality that it doesn't deserve. We can just see it, or egoic thought, random thought. I'll just keep an eye on it, and just make sure it doesn't take me for a ride. And if it does, we get an opportunity to learn from that. But the belief that it won't happen or shouldn't happen is arrogant in the extreme, and dangerous to yourself and to other people. So we can acknowledge that those egoic thoughts may and very likely will um, try to intrude into your seeing of your true nature. Um, but don't draw any conclusions from that other than no, there's it's just the next thought. Okay, there's it's also useful to admit that maybe we'll get hooked, maybe we'll fall on our face, Again, it's not evidence of anything other than we got hooked and fell on our face. We believed something that wasn't actually true, and it caused us or other people distress or suffering. It doesn't mean that the fundamental seeing isn't true. Um, but like I said, it's life's way of refining that seeing so that we get to see on a more and more subtle level um, how tricky the mind can be in this area, and just give it that. It sort of hones our um, clarity. Okay, so one of the things that we can um, notice is that this awakening, like we've been talking, isn't a one-step process. There can be a moment, an experience that we can assign a date to and remember, where there was a significant, profound shift from looking at things one way and looking at it another way. But that doesn't mean it's the end of the story. And I'd even suggest, when I first heard this, was really like disappointing, but I'll say it anyway. So there's a assumption that awakening is the endpoint, is the goal. But the statement that I found surprising and challenging was that awakening isn't the end point, it's actually the beginning point of what could be truly be called spirituality. Everything before that was getting our foot in the door. And after glimpsing our true nature is when deeper work is being called for. It requires a different different sort of perspective, a different stance than what went before. What went before can often be described as efforting, and after that seeing of what we truly are, what's needed would be more accurately described as allowing some process to occur, sort of a stripping away of at an ever more deep level. And a lot of times that happens without knowing how it happens or even when it happens. There's a sense of looking in the rear view mirror and realizing, well, that tendency I had 2 or 3 years ago just doesn't seem to be in play anymore. It's just, I don't know what happened to it. But so there's something about this process once it is, fully engaged and life realizes that we're actually serious about it, that our job is much more about allowing rather than doing. And life has a much far more greater knowing about how this moves than we do from a mental capacity about how we think it should work. That sort of gets in the way. It's really like be attentive, be present, and let it happen. So what we discover with this, when the recognition that this awareness is what we truly are, at first it can feel personal, right? It's like, I finally discovered my awareness, that something that's being generated from within this body mind somehow, maybe from the complexity of my brain, generates this awareness. And I can be in my little awareness bubble here. And it can feel like that. And I'd suggest it feels like that because that's what we were taught. But the actual experience of it, if we feel into it without, um, applying, what we've learned, what we've been taught, the actual feel of it is that it is not locatable within this body mind, and it's not limited to this body mind. It sort of has the feeling of being in the vicinity of this body mind. Um, and but the challenge is to see that what is aware of our cognitive function um, is not necessarily determined by that cognitive function. Um, Cognitive function requires this body mind to perceive, um, to receive, to interpret. But what actually recognizes that is this awareness. And the more we look at it, the more we realize that it's not actually personal. Um, it doesn't, when we really touch into it, we realize that it's not. Um, it has little regard for what our personal desires are. There's a deeper agenda at play. How that informs um, how we live from that. So it's not impersonal as in, some sort of external entity, because it feels as intimate as it possibly could feel. It just doesn't feel personal. It feels open, vast, immense, and yet intimately here, intimate with whatever experience that we may be experiencing, right? Okay, so this awareness itself, when we're talking about humility, this awareness itself isn't humble. It's also not prideful. It's those attributes don't apply to it at all. So it's not like the awareness itself has to try to be humble. No, it's just aware. But from the human side of things, humility is an appropriate, um, let's say, default setting, because we can see, hopefully, the degree of conditioning of these body minds. Um, and from the perspective of awareness, it is okay. It is just what it is. But from the perspective of our humanness, um, it's appropriate to be cautious about stating anything from a personal point of view, claiming anything from the personal point of view. So anybody, if you ever hear anybody say I, implying as a separate person, am enlightened, um, they're seriously mistaken, right? No, no person ever becomes enlightened. Enlightenment is the recognition that there never was a separate self entity. So it's not like the separate self, gradually transform itself into a more and more expansive being. That only happens conceptually in someone's head. But there's never been, in all of history, there's never been a person who became enlightened. Enlightenment happens, enlightenment can be recognized, but it's recognized as that which we already were and just didn't realize it. but it doesn't happen to that sense of separate self that feels like it's located within this body mind that is sort of nominally in charge of things, right? That's that's what we don't find. So Siddhartha never got enlightened, right? You know, when they talk about the Buddha, they talk about that which recognizes enlightenment. You know, Siddhartha, the person still existed, but there was a deep recognition that that identity wasn't housed there. It was housed in the recognition of awareness as our fundamental nature. So that's the reason for his reported statement upon awakening. I and all beings have simultaneously awakened. Right? So that's not a theological statement, right? It's a statement by someone that recognizes their own nature as awareness. If that's truly recognized, then we cannot help but see that it's also the nature of all other humans, indeed all other sentient beings. So if it's the inherent nature of all sentient beings, what would be the basis for self-pride? You know, the I am awake pride. It would only be a disastrous misunderstanding of what had been seen. You know, it's the egoic self coming in the back door claiming credit for something that may have been quite a valid seeing. But that's the power of thought, the power of, you know, our egoic tendencies to test us again and again, to try to demand that that managerial role be reestablished by, you know, this sense of personal self, and to see that over and over again has value in um, establishing this abiding nature of seeing. So the last thing I want to talk about is this idea of perfection, right? This myth that, you know, to be awake is somehow to be perfect. And we can look at some, you know, historical figures that were um, in which awakeness was clearly operating. You know, I often talk about Nisargadatta, who's probably one of the most clear sages of the last century, and most eloquent. And yet, you know, he chain smoked. He smoked through satsangs. He, you know, could occasionally be quite rude with people and impatient, and sometimes kick people out of satsang if he got too impatient with them. You can also, you know, see stories about Jesus getting angry, kicking over the money table, getting severely distraught, in a state of despair in Gethsemane. You know, we can look at the Buddha. I mean, clearly didn't miss many meals from the way he's pictured anyway, in a country where were undoubtedly many starving people. You know, Ramana had this profound shift when he was young, 16 years of age, went off to live in a cave and, you know, didn't, you know, so totally disregarded his body that he couldn't feed himself, and mice were reportedly eating at his decaying flesh until people came along to start to take care of them. So you wouldn't say in his case that, his was a perfect existence. It's perhaps, well respected in India for such sainthood, but, um, you know, I guess I'd like to think that, if you're talking about the perfection of some individual, would be a little bit more well-rounded than that. So, I mean, these are people that clearly have profound depth of um, understanding into the nature of themselves and reality. Um, but, if the standard is that every act, therefore, is perfect, omniscient, these are um, concepts that don't really bear out in reality. It's because a person um, comes to discover their true nature as not a separate self entity, doesn't automatically infer confer capabilities in another area, right? It's like if, let's say, someone who could only speak Swahili, had an awakening experience. They're still only going to be able to speak Swahili. It's not like suddenly they could speak, Chinese or, you know, just because someone's awake, you wouldn't necessarily trust them to do your cataract surgery. I mean, it's different. There's there's skill sets, and then there's, a very profound but very specific area um, that we call awakening. Um, that specific area does open up our life to make life afterwards more enjoyable, more just, it's not like difficult things won't happen, but we approach it from a much different direction. So I want to just briefly end with a story about humility and vigilance um, that I'm quite touched by. Okay, so this is a story about J. Krishnamurti, and if you're not familiar with him, he was born, I think, in the late 1800s and died a few decades ago. And he was discovered by Madame Blavatsky, who was the um, leader, you could say, of the Theosophical movement in the late 1800s, early 1900s. It was quite a popular metaphysical movement back then. And she was in India, and she discovered this street urchin, running around on the beach one day, and uh, sort of took him under her wing. I think he was like 6, 7, 8, something like that. Took him under her wing, mentored him, and eventually sent him to Cambridge University. Very well educated, and was grooming him and ready to announce that he was the reincarnation of Buddha, and he would be leading this Theosophical Society, worldwide society, guarantee for, this young 20-something year old man, of wealth, fame, adoration, respect for the rest of his life, right? That's what was being offered to him on a silver platter. And he turned it down. He had the integrity, the self-honesty, to be able to walk away from that on the basis of what he had discovered for himself, trusted what he had discovered for himself more than this whole spiritual structure that was being offered to him. So this is a street urchin, you know, who was given years of education. And that's what he walked away from. So I once knew someone that met personally alone with J. Krishnamurti shortly before he died. And one of the things she asked him was, why do so many teachers fall off the wagon? And his answer was because they fail to keep their house clean. Fail to remain vigilant for egoic thoughts coming in subtly, seductively. And one of the things that he told her was he had this practice that I was fairly well known, but and he had a fair number of people living in his household or traveling with him, and what he would do every day. Was to shine everybody's shoes. So here's a man with incredible spiritual standing, a staff, 60 years into his enlightenment. Still being willing to practice in a very concrete way humility.